Hey y'all, this is Radical Reads. Today I'm going to be reading Value, Price, and Profit by Karl Marx, first written in 1865. This is a pretty good introduction into Marxist economics where Marx discusses wage labor as a commodity, surplus value, production, supply and demand, and more. It's a fairly dense text, especially compared to the other material I usually upload, but it is extremely important to understand the way capitalism functions as an economic system. We all know that capitalism is bad, but we should know why it's bad, and to do that we need to know how capitalism works. To be totally honest, I struggled with reading this one out loud just because it is super dense and Marx is not a very poetic writer. He's a great thinker, but dude just does not have that melodic flow like Fanon or Mao or Che, so please bear with me if this reading isn't as smooth as usual, but still such an important piece and a good start into Marxist economics. You can find a PDF link to the text in the description below. Be sure to check out my other videos and like, subscribe, share, and leave a comment. I'm always super interested in hearing y'all's thoughts and opinions about the texts I read, even if you disagree with them. If you have any questions or comments about the text, or just want to discuss anything political, or have any other inquiries, feel free to email me at radicalreads1312@gmail.com. Thank y'all for being here, and let's get started. Value, Price, and Profit, written in 1865 by Karl Marx. Citizens, before entering into the subject matter, allow me to make a few preliminary remarks. There reigns now on the continent a real epidemic of strikes, and a general clamor for a rise of wages. The question will turn up at our Congress. You, as the head of the International Association, ought to have settled convictions upon this paramount question. For my own part, I considered it therefore my duty to enter fully into the matter, even at the peril of putting your patience to a severe test. Another preliminary remark I have to make in regard to Citizen Weston. He has not only proposed to you, but has publicly defended in the interest of the working class, as he thinks, opinions he knows to be most unpopular with the working class. Such an exhibition of moral courage all of us might find highly honor. I hope that, despite the unvarnished style of my paper, at its conclusion he will find me agreeing with what appears to me the just idea lying at the bottom of his thesis, which, however, in their present form, I cannot but consider theoretically false and practically dangerous. I shall now at once proceed to the business before us. 1. Production and wages. Citizen Weston's argument rested in fact upon two premises. Firstly, the amount of national production is a fixed thing, a constant quantity or magnitude, as the mathematicians would say. Secondly, that the amount of real wages, that is to say, of wages as measured by the quantity of the commodities they can buy, is a fixed amount, a constant magnitude. Now his first assertion is evidently erroneous. Year after year you will find that the value and mass of production increase, that the productive powers of the national labor increase, and that the amount of money necessary to circulate this increasing production continuously changes. What is true at the end of the year and for different years compared with each other is true for every average day of the year. The amount or magnitude of national production changes continuously. It is not a constant, but a variable magnitude, and apart from changes in population it must be so, because of the continuous change in the accumulation of capital and the productive powers of labor. It is perfectly true that if a rise in the general rate of wages should take place today, that rise, whatever its ulterior effects might be, would, by itself, not immediately change the amount of production. It would, in the first instance, proceed from the existing state of things. But if before the rise of wages, the national production was variable and not fixed, it will continue to be variable and not fixed after the rise of wages. But suppose the amount of national production to be constant instead of variable. Even then, what our friend Weston considers a logical conclusion would still remain a gratuitous assertion. If I have given a number, say 8, The absolute limits of this number do not prevent its parts from changing their relative limits. If profits were 6 and wages 2, wages might increase to 6 and profits decrease to 2, and still the amount remain 8. The fixed amount of production would by no means prove the fixed amount of wages. How, then, does our friend Weston prove this fixity? By asserting it. But even conceding him his assertion, it would cut both ways, while he presses it only in one direction. If the amount of wages is a constant magnitude, then it can be neither increased nor diminished. If then, in enforcing a temporary rise of wages, the working men act foolishly, the capitalists, in enforcing a temporary fall of wages, would act not less foolishly. Our friend Weston does not deny that, under certain circumstances, the working men can enforce a rise of wages, but their amount being naturally fixed, there must follow a reaction. On the other hand, he knows also that the capitalists can enforce a fall of wages, and indeed continuously try to enforce it. According to the principle of the constancy of wages, a reaction ought to follow in this case, not less than in the former. The working men, therefore, reacting against the attempt at or the act of lowering wages, would act rightly. They would, therefore, act rightly in enforcing a rise of wages, because every reaction against the lowering of wages is an action for raising wages. According to Citizen Weston's own principle of the constancy of wages, the working men ought, therefore, under certain circumstances, to combine and struggle for a rise of wages. If he denies this conclusion, he must give up the premise from which it flows. He must not say that the amount of wages is a constant quantity, but that, although it cannot and must not rise, it can and must fall, whenever capital pleases to lower it. If the capitalist pleases to feed you upon potatoes instead of upon meat, and upon oats instead of upon wheat, you must accept his will as a law of political economy and submit to it. If one country the rate of wages is higher than in another, in the United States, for example, than in England, you must explain this difference in the rate of wages by a difference between the will of the American capitalist and the will of the English capitalist, a method which would certainly very much simplify not only the study of economic phenomena, but of all other phenomena. But even then, we might ask why the will of the American capitalist differs from the will of the English capitalist. And to answer the question, you must go beyond the domain of will. A person may tell me that God wills one thing in France and another thing in England. If I summon him to explain this duality of will, he might have the brass to answer me that God wills to have one will in France and another will in England. But our friend Weston is certainly the last man to make an argument of such a complete negation of all reasoning. The will of the capitalist is certainly to take as much as possible. What we have to do is not talk about his will, but to inquire into his power, the limits of that power, and the character of those limits. 2. Production, wages, profits. The address Citizen Weston read to us might have been compressed into a nutshell. All his reasoning amounted to this: if the working class forces the capitalist class to pay 5 shillings instead of 4 in the shape of money wages, the capitalist will return in the shape of commodities 4 shillings is worth instead of 5 shillings is worth. The working class would have to pay 5 shillings for what, before the rise of wages, they bought with 4 shillings. But why is this the case? Why does the capitalist only return 4 shillings' worth for 5 shillings? Because the amount of wages is fixed. Why is it fixed at 4 shillings' worth of commodities? Why not at 3 or 2 or any other sum? If the limit of the amount of wages is settled by an economical law, independent alike of the will of capitalists and the will of the working man, the first thing Citizen Weston had to do was to state that law and prove it. He ought then, moreover, to have proved that the amount of wages actually paid at every given moment always corresponds exactly to the necessary amount of wages and never deviates from it. If, on the other hand, the given limit of the amount of wages is founded on the mere will of the capitalist, or the limits of his avarice, It is an arbitrary limit. There is nothing necessary in it. It may be changed by the will of the capitalist and may therefore be changed against his will. Citizen Weston illustrated this theory by telling you that a bowl contains a certain quantity of soup, to be eaten by a certain numbers of person. An increase in the broadness of the spoons would produce no increase in the amount of soup. He must allow me to find this illustration rather spoony. It reminded me somewhat of the simile employed by Menenius Agrippa. When the Roman plebeians struck against the Roman patricians, the patrician Agrippa told them that the patrician belly fed the plebeian members of the body politic. Agrippa failed to show that you feed the members of one man by filling the belly of another. Citizen Weston, on his part, has forgotten that the bowl from which the workmen eat is filled with the whole produce of national labor, and that what prevents them from fetching more out of it is neither the narrowness of the bowl nor the scantiness of its contents, but only the smallness of their spoons. By what contrivance is the capitalist enabled to return 4 shillings' worth for 5 shillings? By raising the price of the commodity he sells. Now, does arise and more generally a change in the price of commodities? Do the prices of commodities themselves depend on the mere will of the capitalist? Or are, on the contrary, certain circumstances wanted to give effect to that will? If not, the ups and downs, the incessant fluctuations of market prices, become an insoluble riddle. As we suppose that no change whatsoever has taken place either in the productive powers of labor, or in the amount of capital and labor employed, or in the value of the money wherein the values of products are estimated, but only a change in the rate of wages, how could that rise of wages affect the prices of commodities? Only by affecting the actual proportion between the demand for and the supply of these commodities. It is perfectly true that considered as a whole, the working class spends and must spend its income upon necessaries. A general rise in the rate of wages would therefore produce a rise in the demand for, and consequentially, in the market prices of necessaries. The capitalists who produce these necessaries would be compensated for the risen wages by the rising market prices of their commodities. But how with the other capitalists who do not produce necessaries, and you must not fancy them a small body, if you consider that 2/3 of the national produce are consumed by 1/5 of the population? A member of the House Commons stated it recently to be but 1/7 of the population. You will understand what an immense proportion of the national produce must be produced in the shape of luxuries, or be exchanged for luxuries, and what an immense amount of the necessaries themselves must be wasted upon flunkies, horses, cats, and so forth, a waste we know from experience to become always much limited with the rising prices of necessaries. Well, what would be the position of those capitalists who do not produce necessaries? For the fall in the rate of profit consequent upon the general rise of wages, they could not compensate themselves by a rise in the price of their commodities, because the demand for those commodities would not have increased. Their income would have decreased, and from this decreased income they would have had to pay more for the same amount of higher-priced necessaries. But this would not be all. As their income had diminished, they would have less to spend upon luxuries, and therefore their mutual demand for their respective commodities would diminish. Consequent upon this diminished demand, the prices of their commodities would fall. In these branches of industry, therefore, the rate of profit would fall, not only in simple proportion to the general rise in the rate of wages, but in the compound ratio of the general rise of wages, the rise in the prices of necessaries, and the fall in the prices of luxuries. What would be the consequence of this difference in the rate of profit for capitals employed in the different branches of industry? Why, the consequence that generally obtains whenever, from whatever reason, the average rate of profit comes to differ in different spheres of production. Capital and labor would be transferred from the less remunerative to the more remunerative branches, and this process of transfer would go on until the supply in one department of the industry would have risen proportionately to the increased demand, and would have sunk in the other departments according to the decreased demand. This change effected, the general rate of profit would again be equalized in the different branches. As the whole derangement originally arose from a mere change in the proportion of the demand for and supply of different commodities, the case ceasing, the effect would cease, and prices would return to their former level and equilibrium. Instead of being limited to some branches of industry, the fall in the rate of profit consequent upon the rise of wages would have become general. According to our supposition, there would have taken place no change in the productive powers of labor, nor in the aggregate amount of production, but that given amount of production would have changed its form. A greater part of the produce would exist in the shape of necessaries, a lesser part in the shape of luxuries, or what comes to the same, a lesser part would be exchanged for foreign luxuries, and be consumed in its original form, or, what again comes to the same, a greater part of the native produce would be exchanged for foreign necessaries instead of for luxuries. The general rise in the rate of wages would therefore, after a temporary disturbance of market prices, only result in a general fall of the rate of profit without any permanent change in the prices of commodities. If I am told that in the previous argument I assume the whole surplus wages to be spent upon necessaries, I answer that I have made the supposition most advantageous to the opinion of Citizen Weston. If the surplus wages were spent upon articles formerly not entering into the consumption of the working men, the real increase of their purchasing power would need no proof. Being, however, only derived from an advance of wages, that increase of their purchasing power must exactly correspond to the decrease of the purchasing power of the capitalists. The aggregate demand for commodities would, therefore, not increase, but the constituent parts of that demand would change. The increasing demand on the one side would be counterbalanced by the decreasing demand on the other side. Thus, the aggregate demand remaining stationary, no change whatever could take place in the market prices of commodities. You arrive, therefore, at this dilemma. Either the surplus wages are equally spent upon all articles of consumption, then the expansion of demand on the part of the working class must be compensated by the contraction of demand on the part of the capitalist class, or the surplus wages are only spent upon some articles whose market prices will temporarily rise. The consequent rise in the rate of profit in some, and the consequent fall in the rate of profit in other branches of industry will produce a change in the distribution of capital and labor, going on until the supply is brought up to the increased demand in the one department of industry and brought down to the diminished demand in the other departments of industry. On the one supposition, there will occur no change in the prices of commodities. On the other supposition, after some fluctuations of market prices, the exchangeable values of commodities will subside to their former level. On both suppositions, the general rise in the rate of wages will ultimately result in nothing else but a general fall in the rate of profit. To stir up your powers of imagination, Citizen Weston requested you to think of the difficulties which a general rise of English agricultural wages from 9 shillings to 18 shillings would produce. Think, he exclaimed, of the immense rise in the demand for necessaries and the consequent fearful rise in their prices. Now, all of you know that the average wages of the American agricultural laborer amount to more than double that of the English agricultural laborer. Although the prices of agricultural produce are lower in the United States than in the United Kingdom, although the general relations of capital and labor obtain in the United States the same as in England, and although the annual amount of production is much smaller in the United States than in England, why then does our friend ring this alarm bell? Simply to shift the real question before us. A sudden rise of wages from 9 shillings to 18 shillings would be a sudden rise to the amount of 100%. Now, we are not at all discussing the question whether the general rate of wages in England could be suddenly increased by 100%. We have nothing at all to do with the magnitude of the rise, which in every practical instance must depend on and be suited to given circumstances. We have only to inquire how a general rise in the rate of wages, even if restricted to 1%, will act. Dismissing friend Weston's fancy rise of 100%, I propose calling your attention to the real rise of wages that took place in Great Britain from 1849 to 1859. You are all aware of the 10 hours bill, or rather 10.5 hours bill, introduced since 1848. This was one of the greatest economical changes we have witnessed. It was a sudden and compulsory rise of wages, not in some local trades, but in the leading industrial branches by which England sways the markets of the world. It was a rise of wages under circumstances singularly unpropitious. Dr. Ure, Professor Senior, and all the other official economical mouthpieces of the middle class proved, and I must say upon much stronger grounds than those of our friend Weston, that it would sound the death knell of English industry. They proved that it not only amounted to the simple rise of wages, but to a rise of wages initiated by and based upon diminution of the quantity of labor employed. They asserted that the 12th hour you wanted to take from the capitalist was exactly the only hour from which he derived his profit. They threatened a decrease of accumulation, rise of prices, loss of markets, stinting of production, consequent reaction upon wages, ultimate ruin. In fact, they declared Maximilian Robespierre's maximum laws to be a small affair compared to it, and they were right in a certain sense. Well, what was the result? A rise in the money wages of the factory operatives, despite the curtailing of the working day, a great increase in the number of factory hands employed, a continuous fall in the price of their products, a marvelous development in the productive powers of their labor, an unheard of progressive expansion of the markets for their own commodities. In Manchester, at the meeting in 1860 of the Society for the Advancement of Science, I myself heard Mr. Newman confess that he, Dr. Ure, Senior, and all other official propounders of economical science had been wrong, while the instinct of the people had been right. I mention Mr. W. Newman, not Professor Francis Newman, because he occupies an eminent position in economical science as the contributor to and editor of Mr. Thomas Tooke's History of Prices, that magnificent work which traces the history of prices from 1793 to 1856. If our friend Weston's fixed idea of a fixed amount of wages, a fixed amount of production, a fixed degree of the productive power of labor, a fixed and permanent will of the capitalist, and all his other fixedness and finality were correct, Professor Senior's woeful forebodings would be right, and Robert Owen, who already in 1816 proclaimed a general limitation of the working day the first preparatory step to the emancipation of the working class, and actually, in the teeth of the general prejudice, inaugurated it on his own hook in his cotton factory at New Lanark, would have been wrong. In the very same period during which the introduction of the 10 hours bill and the rise of wages consequent upon it occurred, there took place in Great Britain, for reasons which it would be out of place to enumerate here, a general rise in agricultural wages. Although it is not required for my immediate purpose, in order not to mislead you, I shall make some preliminary remarks. If a man got 2 shillings weekly wages, and if his wages rose to 4 shillings, the rate of wages would have risen by 100%. This would seem a very magnificent thing if expressed as a rise in the rate of wages, although the actual amount of wages, 4 shillings weekly, would still remain a wretchedly small, a starvation pittance. You must not, therefore, allow yourselves to be carried away by the high-sounding percents and rates of wages. You must always ask, what was the original amount? Moreover, you will understand that if there were 10 men receiving 2 shillings per week, 5 men each receiving 5 shillings, and 5 men receiving 11 shillings weekly, the 20 men together would receive 100 shillings, or £5 weekly. Then a rise, say by 20%, upon the aggregate sum of their weekly wages took place, there would be an advance from £5 to £6. Taking the average, we might say that the general rate of wages had risen by 25%, although, in fact, the wages of the 10 men had remained stationary. The wages of the one lot of 5 men had risen from 5 shillings to 6 shillings only, and the wages of the other lot of 5 from 55 shillings to 70 shillings. One half of the men would not have improved at all their position. 1/4 would have improved it in an imperceptible degree, and only 1/4 would have bettered it really. Still, reckoning by the average, the total amount of the wages of those 20 men would have increased by 25%, and as far as the aggregate capital that employs them and the prices of the commodities they produce are concerned, it would be exactly the same as if all of them had equally shared in the average rise of wages. In the case of agricultural labor, the standard wages being very different in the different counties of England and Scotland, the rise affected them very unequally. Lastly, during the period when that rise of wages took place, counteracting influences were at work, such as the new taxes consequent upon the Russian War, the extensive demolition of the dwelling houses of the agricultural laborers, and so forth. Having premised so much, I proceed to state that from 1849 to 1859 there took place a rise of about 40% in the average rate of the agricultural wages of Great Britain. I could give you ample details and proof of my assertion, but for the present purpose think it sufficient to refer to you to the conscientious and critical paper read in 1860 by the late Mr. John C. Morton at the London Society of Arts on The Forces Used in Agriculture. Mr. Morton gives the returns from bills and other authentic documents which he had collected from about 100 farmers residing in 12 Scotch and 35 English counties. According to our friend Weston's opinion, and taken together with the simultaneous rise in the wages of the factory operatives, there ought to have occurred a tremendous rise in the prices of agricultural produce during the period 1849 to 1859. But what is the fact? Despite the Russian War and the consecutive unfavorable harvests from 1854 to 1856, the average price of wheat, which is the leading agricultural produce of England, fell from about £3 per quarter for the years 1838 to 1848 to about £2 10 shillings per quarter for the years 1849 to 1859. This constitutes a fall in the price of wheat of more than 16%, simultaneously with an average rise of agricultural wages of 40%. During the same period, if we compare its end with its beginning, 1859 with 1849, there was a decrease of official pauperism from 934,419 to 860,470, the difference being 73,949, a very small decrease, I grant, and which in the following years was again lost, but still a decrease. It might be said that, consequent upon the abolition of the corn laws, the import of foreign corn was more than doubled during the period from 1849 to 1859, as compared with the period from 1838 to 1848. And what of that? From Citizen Weston's standpoint, one would have expected that this sudden, immense, and continuously increasing demand upon foreign markets must have sent up the prices of agricultural produce there to a frightful height, the effect of increased demand remaining the same, whether it comes from without or from within. What was the fact? Apart from some years of failing harvests, during all that period the ruinous fall in the price of corn formed a standing theme of declamation in France. The Americans were again and again compelled to burn their surplus produce, and Russia, if we are to believe Mr. Urquhart, prompted the Civil War in the United States because her agricultural exports were crippled by the Yankee competition in the markets of Europe. Reduced to its abstract form, Citizen Weston's argument would come to this: every rise in demand occurs always on the basis of a given amount of production. It can, therefore, never increase the supply of the articles demanded, but can only enhance their money prices. Now, the most common observation shows, then, an increased demand will, in some instances, leave the market prices of commodities altogether unchanged, and will, in other instances, cause a temporary rise of market prices, followed by an increased supply, followed by a reduction of the prices to their original level, and in many cases below their original level. Whether the rise of demand springs from surplus wages or from any other cause does not at all change the conditions of the problem. From Citizen Weston's standpoint, the general phenomenon was as difficult to explain as the phenomenon occurring under the exceptional circumstances of a rise of wages. His argument had therefore no peculiar bearings whatever upon the subject we treat. It only expressed his perplexity at accounting for the laws by which an increase of demand produces an increase of supply, instead of an ultimate rise of market prices. 3. Wages and currency. On the second day of the debate, our friend Weston clothed his old assertions in new forms. He said, consequent upon a general rise in money wages, more currency will be wanted to pay the same wages. The currency being fixed, how can you pay with this fixed currency increased money wages? First, the difficulty arose from the fixed amount of commodities accruing to the working man despite his increase of money wages. Now it arises from the increased money wages despite the fixed amount of commodities. Of course, if you reject his original dogma, his secondary grievance will disappear. However, I shall show that this currency question has nothing at all to do with the subject before us. In your country, the mechanism of payments is much more perfected than in any other country of Europe. Thanks to the extent and concentration of the banking system, much less currency is wanted to circulate the same amount of values and to transact the same or a greater amount of business. For example, as far as wages are concerned, the English factory operative pays his wages weekly to the shopkeeper, who sends them weekly to the banker, who returns them weekly to the manufacturer, who again pays them away to his working men, and so forth. By this contrivance, the yearly wages of an operative, say of £52, may be paid by one single sovereign, turning round every week in the same circle. Even in England, the mechanism is less perfect than in Scotland, and is not everywhere equally perfect. And therefore we find, for example, that in some agricultural districts, much more currency is wanted to circulate a much smaller amount of values. If you cross the Channel, you will find that money wages are much lower than in England, but that they are circulated in Germany, Italy, Switzerland, and France by a much larger amount of currency. The same sovereign will not be so quickly intercepted by the banker or returned to the industrial capitalist, and therefore, instead of one sovereign circulating £52 yearly, you want perhaps 3 sovereigns to circulate yearly wages to the amount of £25. Thus, by comparing continental countries with England, you will see at once that low money wages may require a much larger currency for their circulation than high money wages, and that this is, in fact, a merely technical point, quite foreign to our subject. According to the best calculations I know, the yearly income of the working class of this country may be estimated at £250 million. This immense sum is circulated by about £3 million. Suppose a rise of wages of 50% to take place. Then, instead of 3 millions of currency, 4.5 millions would be wanted. As a very considerable part of the working man's daily expenses is laid out in silver and copper, that is to say in mere tokens, whose relative value to gold is arbitrarily fixed by law, like that of inconvertible money paper, a rise of money wages by 50% would, in the extreme case, require an additional circulation of sovereigns, say to the amount of 1 million. 1 million now dormant in the shape of bullion or coin in the cellars of the Bank of England or of private bankers would circulate. but even the trifling expense resulting from the additional minting or the additional wear and tear of that million might be spared, and would actually be spared, if any friction should arise from the want of the additional currency. All of you know that the currency of this country is divided into two great departments. One sort, supplied by banknotes of different descriptions, is used in the transaction between dealers and dealers, and the larger payments from consumers to dealers, while another sort of currency, metallic coin, circulates in the retail trade. Although distinct, these two sorts of currencies intermix with each other. Thus, gold coin, to a very great extent, circulates even in larger payments for all the odd sums under £5. If tomorrow £4 notes, or £3 notes, or £2 notes were issued, the gold filling these channels of circulation would at once be driven out of them, and flow into those channels where they would be needed from the increase of money wages. Thus, the additional million required by an advance of wages by 50% would be supplied without the addition of one single sovereign. The same effect might be produced without one additional banknote, by an additional bill circulation, as was the case for Lancashire for a very considerable time. If a general rise in the rate of wages, for example, of 100%, as Citizen Weston supposed it to take place in agricultural wages, would produce a great rise in the price of necessaries, and, according to his views, require an additional amount of currency not to be procured, a general fall in wages must produce the same effect, on the same scale, in the opposite direction. Well, all of you know that the years of 1858 to 1860 were the most prosperous years for the cotton industry, and that peculiarly the year 1860 stands in that respect unrivaled in the annals of commerce, while at the same time all other branches of industry were most flourishing. The wages of the cotton operatives and of all other working men connected with their trade stood in 1860 higher than ever before. The American crisis came, and those aggregate wages were suddenly reduced to about 1/4 of their former amount. This would have been in the opposite direction, a rise of 400%. If wages rise from 5 to 20, we say that they rise by 400%. If they fall from 20 to 5, we say that they fall by 75%. But the amount of rise in one and the amount of fall in the other case would be the same, namely 15 shillings. This, then, was a sudden change in the rate of wages unprecedented, and, at the same time, extending over a number of operatives which, if we count all the operatives, not only directly engaged in but indirectly dependent upon the cotton trade, was larger by 1/2 the average of agricultural laborers. Did the price of wheat fall? It rose from the annual average of 47 shillings 8 pence per quarter during the 3 years of 1858 to 1860 to the annual average of 55 shillings 10 pence per quarter during the 3 years 1861 to 1863. As to the currency, there were coined in the mint in 1861 £8,673,323 pounds against £3,378,792 pounds in 1860. That is to say, there were coined £5,294,440 pounds more in 1861 than in 1860. It is true the banknote circulation was in 1861 less by £1,319,000 than in 1860. Take this off. There remains still a surplus of currency for the year 1861 as compared with the prosperity year 1860 to the amount of £3,975,440, or about £4 millions, but the bullion reserve in the Bank of England had simultaneously decreased, not quite to the same, but in an approximating proportion. Compare the year 1862 with 1842. Apart from the immense increase in the value and amount of commodities circulated, in 1862 the capital paid in regular transactions for shares, loans, etc., for the railways in England and Wales amounted alone to £320,000,000, a sum that would have appeared fabulous in 1842. Still, the aggregate amounts in currency in 1862 and 1842 were pretty nearly equal, and generally you will find a tendency to a progressive diminution of currency in the face of enormously increasing value, not only of commodities, but of monetary transactions generally. From our friend Weston's standpoint, this is an unsolvable riddle. Looking somewhat deeper into this matter, he would have found that quite apart from wages, and supposing them to be fixed, the value and mass of the commodities to be circulated, and generally the amount of monetary transactions to be settled, vary daily, that the amount of bank notes issued varies daily, that the amount of payments realized without the intervention of any money by the instrumentality of bills, checks, books credit, clearing houses varies daily, that, as far as actual metallic currency is required, the proportion between the coin in circulation and the coin and bullion in reserve, or sleeping in the cellars of banks, varies daily, that the amount of bullion absorbed by the national circulation and the amount being sent abroad for international circulation vary daily. He would have found that this dogma of a fixed currency is a monstrous error, incompatible with our everyday movement. He would have inquired into the laws which enable a currency to adapt itself to circumstances so continually changing, instead of turning his misconception of the laws of currency into an argument against the rise of wages. 4. Supply and demand. Our friend Weston accepts the Latin proverb that repetitio est mater studiorum, that is to say, that repetition is the mother of study, and consequently he repeated his original dogma again under the new form, that the contraction of currency, resulting from an enhancement of wages, would produce a diminution of capital, and so forth. Having already dealt with this currency crotchet, I consider it quite useless to enter upon the imaginary consequences he fancies to flow from his imaginary currency mishap. I shall proceed to at once reduce his one and the same dogma repeated in so many different shapes to its simplest theoretical form. The uncritical way in which he has treated his subject will become evident from one single remark. He pleads against a rise of wages or against high wages as a result of such a rise. Now I ask him, what are high wages and what are low wages? Why constitute, for example, 5 shillings weekly low and 20 shillings weekly high wages? If 5 is low as compared with 20, 20 is still lower as compared with 200. If a man was to lecture on the thermometer, and commenced by declaiming on high and low degrees, he would impart no knowledge whatever. He must first tell me how the freezing point is found out, and how the boiling point, and how these standard points are settled by natural laws, not by the fancy of the sellers or makers of thermometers. Now, in regard to wages and profits, Citizen Weston has not only failed to deduce such standard points from economical laws, but he has not even felt the necessity to look after them. He satisfied himself with the acceptance of the popular slang terms of low and high as something having a fixed meaning, although it is self-evident that wages can only be said to be high or low as compared with a standard by which to measure their magnitudes. He will be unable to tell me why a certain amount of money is given for a certain amount of labor. If he should answer me, this was settled by the law of supply and demand, I should ask him, in the first instance, by what law supply and demand are themselves regulated, and such an answer would at once put him out of court. The relations between supply and demand of labor undergo perpetual change, and with them the market prices of labor. If the demand overshoots the supply, wages rise. If the supply overshoots the demand, wages sink. Although it might in such circumstances be necessary to test the real state of supply and demand by a strike, for example, or any other method. But if you accept supply and demand as the law regulating wages, it would be as childish as useless to declaim against a rise of wages, because, according to the supreme law you appeal to, a periodical rise of wages is quite as necessary and legitimate as a periodical fall of wages. If you do not accept supply and demand as the law regulating wages, I again repeat the question: why a certain amount of money is given for a certain amount of labor. But to consider matters more broadly, you would be altogether mistaken in fancying that the value of labor or of any other commodity, whatever, is ultimately fixed by supply and demand. Supply and demand regulate nothing but the temporary fluctuations of market prices. They will explain to you why the market price of a commodity rises above or sinks below its value, but they can never account for the value itself. Suppose supply and demand to equilibrate, or, as the economists call it, to cover each other. Why, the very moment these opposite forces become equal, they paralyze each other and cease to work in the one or other direction. At the moment when supply and demand equilibrate each other and therefore cease to act, the market price of a commodity coincides with its real value, with the standard price round which its market prices oscillate. In inquiring into the nature of that value, we have therefore nothing at all to do with the temporary effects on market prices of supply and demand. The same holds true of wages and of the prices of all other commodities. 5. Wages and prices. Reduced to their simplest theoretical expression, all our friends' arguments resolve themselves into this one dogma: the prices of commodities are determined or regulated by wages. I might appeal to practical observation to bear witness against this antiquated and exploded fallacy. I might tell you that the English factory operatives, miners, shipbuilders, and so forth, whose labor is relatively high-priced, undersell by the cheapness of their products all other nations, while the English agricultural laborer, for example, whose labor is relatively low-priced, is undersold by almost every other nation because of the dearness of his produce. By comparing article with article in the same country, and the commodities of different countries, I might show, apart from some exceptions more apparent than real, that on an average the high-priced labor produces the low-priced, and the low-priced labor produces the high-priced commodities. This, of course, would not prove that the high price of labor in the one and its low price in the other instance are the respective causes of those diametrically opposed effects, but at all events it would prove that the prices of commodities are not ruled by the prices of labor. However, it is quite superfluous for us to employ this empirical method. It might, perhaps, be denied that Citizen Weston has put forward the dogma: the prices of commodities are determined or regulated by wages. In point of fact, he has never formulated it. He said, on the contrary, that profit and rent also form constituent parts of the prices of commodities, but it is out of the prices of commodities that not only the working man's wages, but also the capitalist's profits and the landlord's rents must be paid. But how in his idea are prices formed? First, by wages. Then an additional percentage is joined to the price on behalf of the capitalist, and another additional percentage on behalf of the landlord. Suppose the wages of the labor employed in the production of a commodity to be 10. If the rate of profit was 100%, to the wages advanced the capitalist would add 10. And if the rate of rent was also 100% upon the wages, there would be added 10 more, and the aggregate price of the commodity would amount to 30. But such a determination of prices would be simply their determination by wages. If wages in the above case rose to 20, the price of the commodity would rise to 60, and so forth. Consequently, all the superannuated writers on political economy who propounded the dogma that wages regulated prices have tried to prove it by treating profit and rent as mere additional percentages upon wages. None of them were, of course, able to reduce the limits of those percentages to any economic law. They seem, on the contrary, to think profits settled by tradition, custom, the will of the capitalist, or by some other equally arbitrary and inexplicable method. If they assert that they are settled by the competition between the capitalists, they say nothing. That competition is sure to equalize the different rates of profit in different trades, or reduce them to one average level, but it can never determine the level itself, or the general rate of profit. What do we mean by saying that the prices of the commodities are determined by wages? Wages being but a name for the price of labor, we mean that the prices of commodities are regulated by the price of labor. As price is exchangeable value, and in speaking of value I speak always of exchangeable value, is exchangeable value expressed in money. The proposition comes to this, that the value of commodities is determined by the value of labor, or that the value of labor is the general measure of value. But how, then, is the value of labor itself determined? Here we come to a standstill. Of course, we come to a standstill if we try reasoning logically, yet the propounders of that doctrine make short work of logical scruples. Take our friend Weston, for example. First, he told us that wages regulate the price of commodities, and that consequently, when wages rise, prices must rise. Then he turned round to show us that a rise of wages will be no good, because the prices of commodities had risen, and because wages were indeed measured by the prices of the commodities upon which they are spent. Thus, we begin by saying that the value of labor determines the value of commodities, and we wind up by saying that the value of commodities determines the value of labor. Thus, we move to and fro in the most vicious circle, and arrive at no conclusion at all. On the whole, it is evident that by making the value of one commodity, say labor, corn, or any other commodity, the general measure and regulator of value, we only shift the difficulty, since we determine one value by another, which on its side wants to be determined. The dogma that wages determine the prices of commodities, expressed in its most abstract terms, comes to this, that value is determined by value, and this tautology means that in fact we know nothing at all about value. Accepting this premise, all reasoning about the general laws of political economy turns into mere twaddle. It was therefore the great merit of Ricardo that in his work on the Principles of Political Economy, published in 1817, he fundamentally destroyed the old popular and worn-out fallacy that wages determine prices, a fallacy which Adam Smith and his French predecessors had spurned in the really scientific parts of their researches, but which they reproduced in their more exoterical and vulgarizing chapters. 6. Value and labor. Citizens, I've now arrived at a point where I must enter upon the real development of the question. I cannot promise to do this in a very satisfactory way, because to do so I should be obliged to go over the whole field of political economy. I can, as the French would say, but effleurer la question, touch upon the main points. The first question we have to put is, what is the value of a commodity? How is it determined? At first sight, it would seem that the value of a commodity is a thing quite relative, and not to be settled without considering one commodity in its relation to all other commodities. In fact, in speaking of the value in exchange of a commodity, we mean the proportional quantities in which it exchanges with all other commodities. But then arises the question, how are the proportions in which commodities exchange with each other regulated? We know from experience that these proportions vary infinitely. Taking one single commodity, wheat, for instance, we shall find that a quarter of wheat exchanges in almost countless variations of proportion with different commodities, yet its value remaining always the same, whether expressed in silk, gold, or any other commodity. It must be something distinct from and independent of these different rates of exchange with different articles. It must be possible to express in a very different form these various equations with various commodities. Besides, if I say a quarter of wheat exchanges with iron in a certain proportion, or the value of a quarter of wheat is expressed in a certain amount of iron, I say that the value of wheat and its equivalent in iron are equal to some third thing, which is neither wheat nor iron, because I suppose them to express the same magnitude in two different shapes. Either of them, the wheat or the iron, must, therefore, independently of the other, be reducible to this third thing, which is their common measure. To elucidate this point, I shall recur to a very simple geometrical illustration. In comparing the areas of triangles of all possible forms and magnitudes, or comparing triangles with rectangles, or any other rectilinear figure, how do we proceed? We reduce the area of any triangle, whatever an expression quite different from its visible form. Having found from the nature of the triangle that its area is equal to half the product of its base by its height, we can then compare the different values of all sorts of triangles, and of all rectilinear figures whatever, because all of them may be resolved into a certain number of triangles. The same mode of procedure must obtain with the values of commodities. We must be able to reduce all of them to an expression common to all, and distinguishing them only by their proportions, in which they contain that identical measure. As the exchangeable values of commodities are only social functions of those things, and have nothing at all to do with the natural qualities, we must first ask, what is the common social substance of all commodities? It is labor. To produce a commodity, a certain amount of labor must be bestowed upon it, or worked up in it. I say not only labor, but social labor. A man who produces an article for his own immediate use to consume it himself creates a product, but not a commodity. As a self-sustaining producer, he has nothing to do with society. But to produce a commodity, a man must not only produce an article satisfying some social want, but his labor itself must form part and parcel of the total sum of labor expended by society. It must be subordinate to the division of labor within society. It is nothing without the other divisions of labor, and on its part is required to integrate them. If we consider commodities as values, we consider them exclusively under the single aspect of realized, fixed, or, if you like, crystallized social labor. In this respect, they can differ only by representing greater or smaller quantities of labor, as, for example, a greater amount of labor may be worked up in a silken handkerchief than in a brick. But how does one measure quantities of labor? By the time the labor lasts, in measuring the labor by the hour, the day, etc. Of course, to apply this measure, all sorts of labor are reduced to average or simple labor as their unit. We arrive therefore at this conclusion: a commodity has a value because it is a crystallization of social labor. The greatness of its value or its relative value depends upon the greater or less amount of that social substance contained in it. That is to say, on the relative mass of labor necessary for its production. The relative values of commodities are therefore determined by the respective quantities or amounts of labor worked up, realized, fixed in them. The correlative quantities of commodities which can be produced in the same time of labor are equal, or the value of one commodity is to the value of another commodity, as the quantity of labor is fixed in the one is to the quantity of labor fixed in the other. I suspect that many of you will ask, does then indeed there exist such a vast or any difference whatever between the determining the values of commodities by wages and determining them by the relative quantities of labor necessary for their production? You must, however, be aware that the reward for labor and quantity of labor are quite disparate things. Suppose, for example, equal quantities of labor to be fixed in 1/4 of wheat and 1 ounce of gold. I resort to the example because it was used by Benjamin Franklin in his first essay published in 1721, and entitled A Modest Inquiry into the Nature and Necessity of a Paper Currency, where he, one of the first, hit upon the true nature of value. Well, We suppose then that 1/4 of wheat and 1 ounce of gold are equal values or equivalents, because they are crystallizations of equal amounts of average labor, of so many days' or so many weeks' labor respectively fixed in them. In thus determining the relative values of gold and corn, do we refer in any way whatever to the wages of the agricultural laborer and the miner? Not a bit. We leave it quite indeterminate of how their days' or weeks' labor was paid, or even whether wage labor was employed at all. If it was, wages may have been very unequal. The laborer whose labor is realized in the 1/4 of wheat may receive 2 bushels only, and the laborer employed in mining may receive 1½ of the ounce of gold. Or, supposing their wages to be equal, they may deviate in all possible proportions from the values of the commodities produced by them. They may amount to 1/4, 1/5, or any other proportional part of the 1/4 of corn, or the 1 ounce of gold. Their wages can, of course, not exceed, not be more than the values of the commodities they produced, but they can be less in every possible degree. Their wages will be limited by the values of the products, but the values of their products will not be limited by the wages, and, above all, the relative values of corn and gold, for example, will have been settled without any regard whatever to the value of the labor employed, that is to say, to wages. To determine the values of commodities by the relative quantities of labor fixed in them is therefore a thing quite different from the tautological method of determining the values of commodities by their value of labor, or by wages. This point, however, will be further elucidated in the progress of our inquiry. In calculating the exchangeable value of a commodity, we must add to the quantity of labor previously worked up in the raw material of the commodity, and the labor bestowed on the implements, tools, machinery, and buildings with which such labor is assisted. For example, the value of a certain amount of cotton yarn is the crystallization of the quantity of labor added to the cotton during the spinning process, the quantity of labor previously realized in the cotton itself, the quantity of labor realized in the coal, oil, and other auxiliary substances used, the quantity of labor fixed in the steam engine, the spindles, the factory building, and so forth. Instruments of production properly so called, such as tools, machinery, buildings, serve again and again for longer or shorter period during the repeated process of production. If they were used up at once, like the raw material, their whole value would at once be transferred to the commodities they assist in producing. But as a spindle, for example, is but gradually used up, an average calculation is made, based upon the average time it lasts, and its average waste and wear and tear during a certain period, say a day. In this way we calculate how much of the value of the spindle is transferred to the yarn daily spin, and how much, therefore, of the total amount of labor is realized in a pound of yarn, for example, is due to the quantity of labor previously realized in the spindle. For our present purpose, it is not necessary to dwell any longer upon this point. It might seem that if the value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of labor bestowed upon its production, the lazier a man or the clumsier a man, the more valuable his commodity, because the greater the time of labor required for finishing the commodity. This, however, would be a sad mistake. You will recollect that I use the word social labor, and many points are involved in this qualification of social. In saying that the value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of labor worked up or crystallized in it, we mean the quantity of labor necessary for its production in a given state of society under certain social average conditions of production, with a given social average intensity and average skill of the labor employed. When in England the power loom came to compete with the hand loom, only half the former time of labor was wanted to convert a given amount of yarn into a yard of cotton or cloth. The poor hand loom weaver now worked 17 or 18 hours daily, instead of the 9 or 10 hours he had worked before. Still, the product of 20 hours of his labor represented now only 10 social hours of labor, or 10 hours of labor socially necessary for the conversion of a certain amount of yarn into textile stuffs. His product of 20 hours had therefore no more value than his former product of 10 hours. If, then, the quantity of socially necessary labor realized in commodities regulates their exchangeable values, every increase in the quantity of labor wanted for the production of a commodity must augment its value, as every diminution must lower it. If the respective quantities of labor necessary for the production of the respective commodities remained constant, their relative values would also be constant, but such is not the case. The quantity of labor necessary for the production of a commodity changes continuously with the changes in the productive powers of labor. The more produce is finished in a given time of labor, and, the smaller the productive powers of labor, the less produce is finished in the same time. If, for example, in the progress of population it should become necessary to cultivate less fertile soils, the same amount of produce would only be attainable by a greater amount of labor spent, and the value of agricultural produce would consequently rise. On the other hand, if, with the modern means of production, a single spinner converts into yarn during one working day many thousand times the amount of cotton which he could have spun during the same time with the spinning wheel, it is evident that every single pound of cotton will absorb many thousand times less of spinning labor than it did before, and consequently the value added by spinning to every single pound of cotton will be 1,000 times less than before. The value of yarn will sink accordingly. Apart from the different natural energies and acquired working abilities of different peoples, the productive powers of labor must principally depend, firstly, upon the natural conditions of labor, such as fertility of soil, mines, and so forth. Secondly, upon the progressive improvement of the social powers of labor, such as are derived from production on a grand scale, concentration of capital and combination of labor, subdivision of labor, machinery, improved methods, appliance of chemical and other natural agencies, shortening of time and space by means of communication and transport, and any other contrivance by which science presses natural agencies into the service of labor, and by which the social or cooperative character of labor is developed. The greater the productive powers of labor, the less labor is bestowed upon a given amount of produce, hence the smaller the value of produce. The smaller the productive powers of labor, the more labor is bestowed upon the same amount of produce, hence the greater its value. As a general law, we may therefore set it down that the values of commodities are directly as the times of labor employed in their production, and are inversely as the productive powers of the labor employed. Having till now only spoken of value, I shall add a few words about price, which is a peculiar form assumed by value. Price, taken by itself, is nothing but the monetary expression of value. The values of all commodities of the country, for example, are expressed in gold prices, while on the continent they are mainly expressed in silver prices. The value of gold or silver, like that of all other commodities, is regulated by the quantity of labor necessary for getting them. You exchange a certain amount of your national products, in which a certain amount of your national labor is crystallized, for the produce of gold and silver producing countries, in which a certain quantity of their labor is crystallized. It is in this way, in fact by barter, that you learn to express in gold and silver the value of all commodities, that is, the respective quantities of labor bestowed upon them. Looking somewhat closer into the monetary expression of value, or what comes to the same, the conversion of value into price, you will find that it is a process by which you give the values of all commodities an independent and homogeneous form, or by which you express them as quantities of equal social labor. So far as it is but the monetary expression of value, price has been called natural price by Adam Smith, prix nécessaire by the French physiocrats. What then is the relation between value and market prices, or between natural prices and market prices? You all know that the market price is the same for all commodities of the same kind. However, the conditions of production may differ for the individual producers. The market price expresses only the average amount of social labor necessary, under the average conditions of production, to supply the market with a certain mass of a certain article. It is calculated upon the whole lot of a commodity of a certain description. So far, the market price of a commodity coincides with its value. On the other hand, the oscillations of market prices, rising now over, sinking now under the value or natural price, depends upon the fluctuations of supply and demand. The deviations of market prices from values are continual, but as Adam Smith says, the natural price is the central price to which the prices of commodities are continually gravitating. Different accidents may sometimes keep them suspended a good deal above it, and sometimes force them down even somewhat below it, but whatever may be the obstacles which hinder them from settling in this center of repose and continuance, they are constantly tending towards it. I cannot now sift this matter. It suffices to say that if supply and demand equilibrate each other, the market prices of commodities will correspond with their natural prices, that is to say, with their values, as determined by the respective quantities of labor required for their production. But supply and demand must constantly tend to equilibrate each other, although they do so only by compensating one fluctuation by another, a rise by a fall, and vice versa. If instead of considering only the daily fluctuations you analyze the movement of market prices for longer periods, as Mr. Tooke, for example, has done in his History of Prices, you will find that the fluctuations of market prices, their deviations from values, their ups and downs, paralyze and compensate each other, so that apart from the effect of monopolies and some other modifications, I must now pass by all descriptions of commodities are, on average, sold at their respective values, or natural prices. The average periods during which the fluctuations of market prices compensate each other are different for different kinds of commodities, because with one kind it is easier to adapt supply to demand than with the other. If then, speaking broadly and embracing somewhat longer periods, all descriptions of commodities sell at their respective values, it is nonsense to suppose that profit, not in individual cases, but that the constant and usual prices of different trades spring from the prices of commodities, or selling them at a price over and above their value. The absurdity of this notion becomes evident if it is generalized. What a man would constantly win as a seller, he would constantly lose as a purchaser. It would not do to say that there are men who are buyers without being sellers, or consumers without being producers. What these people pay to the producers, they must first get from them for nothing. If a man first takes your money and afterwards returns that money in buying your commodities, you will never enrich yourselves by selling your commodities too dear to that same man. This sort of transaction might diminish a loss, but would never help in realizing a profit. To explain, therefore, the general nature of profits, you must start from the theorem that on an average, commodities are sold at their real values, and that profits are derived from selling them at their values, that is, in proportion to the quantity of labor realized in them. If you cannot explain profit upon this supposition, you cannot explain it at all. This seems paradox and contrary to everyday observation. It is also paradox that earth moves round the sun and that water consists of two highly inflammable gases. Scientific truth is always paradox, if judged by everyday experience, which catches only the delusive appearance of things. 7. Labor power. Having now, as far as it could be done in such a cursory manner, analyzed the nature of the value of any commodity whatever, we must turn our attention to the specific value of labor. And here, again, I must startle you by seeming paradox. All of you feel sure that what they daily sell is their labor, that therefore labor has a price, and that, the price of a commodity being only the monetary expression of its value, there must certainly exist such a thing as the value of labor. However, there exists no such thing as the value of labor in the common acceptance of the word. We have seen that the amount of necessary labor crystallized in a commodity constitutes its value. Now, applying this notion of value, how could we define, say, the value of 10 hours working day? How much labor is contained in that day? 10 hours is labor. To say that the value of a 10 hours working day is equal to 10 hours is labor, or the quantity of labor contained in it, would be a tautological and moreover a nonsensical expression. Of course, having once found out the true but hidden sense of the expression value of labor, we shall be able to interpret this irrational and seemingly impossible application of value in the same way that, having once made sure of the real movement of the celestial bodies, we shall be able to explain their apparent or merely phenomenal movements. What the working man sells is not directly his labor but his laboring power, the temporary disposal of which he makes over to the capitalist. This is so much the case that I do not know whether by the English laws, but certainly by some continental laws, the maximum time is fixed for which a man is allowed to sell his laboring power. If allowed to do so for any indefinite period whatever, slavery would immediately be restored. Such a sale, if it comprised his lifetime, for example, would make him at once the lifelong slave of his employer. One of the oldest economists and most original philosophers of England, Thomas Hobbes, has already in his Leviathan instinctively hit upon this point overlooked by all his successors. He says, "The value or worth of a man is, as in all other things, his price. That is so much as would be given for the use of his power." Proceeding from this basis, we shall be able to determine the value of labor as that of all other commodities. But before doing so we might ask, how does this strange phenomena arise, that we find on the market a set of buyers possessed of land, machinery, raw material, and the means of subsistence, all of them, save land in its crude state, the products of labor, and on the other hand, a set of sellers who have nothing to sell except their laboring power, their working arms and brains? That the one set buys continually in order to make a profit and enrich themselves, while the other set continually sells in order to earn their livelihood. The inquiry into this question would be an inquiry into what the economists call previous or original accumulation, but which ought to be called original expropriation. We should find that this so-called original accumulation means nothing but a series of historical processes, resulting in a decomposition of the original union existing between laboring man and his instruments of labor. Such an inquiry, however, lies beyond the pale of my present subject. The separation between the man of labor and the instruments of labor once established, such a state of things will maintain itself and reproduce itself upon a constantly increasing scale, until a new and fundamental revolution in the mode of production should again overturn it, and restore the original union in a new historical form. What, then, is the value of laboring power? Like that of every other commodity, its value is determined by the quantity of labor necessary to produce it. The laboring power of a man exists only in his living individuality. A certain mass of necessaries must be consumed by a man to grow up and maintain his life, but the man, like the machine, will wear out and must be replaced by another man. Beside the mass of necessaries required for his own maintenance, he wants another amount of necessaries to bring up a certain quota of children that are to replace him on the labor market and to perpetuate the race of laborers. Moreover, to develop his laboring power and acquire a given skill, another amount of values must be spent. For our purpose it suffices to consider only average labor, the costs of whose education and development are vanishing magnitudes. Still, I must seize upon this occasion to state that as the costs of producing laboring powers of different quality differ, so much differ the values of the laboring powers employed in different trades. The cry for an equality of wages rests therefore upon a mistake, and is an inane wish never to be fulfilled. It is an offspring of that false and superficial radicalism that accepts premises and tries to evade conclusions. Upon the basis of the wages system, the value of laboring power is settled like that of every other commodity, and as different kinds of laboring power have different values, or require different quantities of labor for their production, they must fetch different prices in the labor market. To clamor for equal or even equitable retribution on the basis of the wages system is the same as to clamor for freedom on the basis of the slavery system. What you think just or equitable is out of the question. The question is, what is necessary and unavoidable with a given system of production? After what has been said, it will be seen that the value of laboring power is determined by the value of necessaries required to produce, develop, maintain, and perpetuate the laboring power. 8. Production of surplus value. Now suppose that the average amount of the daily necessaries of a laboring man require 6 hours of average labor for their production. Suppose, moreover, 6 hours of average labor to be also realized in a quantity of gold equal to 3 shillings. Then 3 shillings would be the price, or the monetary expression of the daily value of the man's laboring power. If he worked daily 6 hours, he would daily produce a value sufficient to buy the average amount of his daily necessaries, or to maintain himself as a laboring man. But our man is a wages laborer. He must, therefore, sell his laboring power to a capitalist. If he sells it at 3 shillings daily or at 18 shillings weekly, he sells it at its value. Suppose him to be a spinner. If he works 6 hours daily, he will add to the cotton a value of 3 shillings daily. This value, daily added by him, would be an exact equivalent for the wages, or the price of his laboring power received daily. But in that case, no surplus value or surplus produce whatever would go to the capitalist. He then would come to the rub. In buying the laboring power of the workman and paying its value, the capitalist, like every other purchaser, has acquired the right to consume or use the commodity bought. You consume or use the laboring power of a man by making him work, as you consume or use a machine by making it run. By buying the daily or weekly value of the laboring power of the workman, the capitalist has, therefore, acquired the right to use or make that laboring power during the whole day or week. The working day or the working week has, of course, certain limits, but those we shall afterwards look more closely at. For the present, I want to turn your attention to one decisive point. The value of the laboring power is determined by the quantity of labor necessary to maintain or reproduce it, but the use of that laboring power is only limited by the active energies and physical strength of that laborer. The daily or weekly value of the laboring power is quite distinct from the daily or weekly exercise of that power. The same as the food a horse wants and the time it can carry the horseman are quite distinct. The quantity of labor by which the value of the working man's laboring power is limited forms by no means a limit to the quantity of labor which his laboring power is apt to perform. Take the example of our spinner. We have to see that to daily reproduce his laboring power, he must daily reproduce a value of 3 shillings, which he will do by working 6 hours daily. But this does not disable him from working 10 or 12 or more hours a day, but by paying the daily or weekly value of the spinner's laboring power, the capitalist has acquired the right of using that laboring power during the whole day or week. He will, therefore, make him work, say daily 12 hours, over and above the 6 hours required to replace his wages, or the value of his laboring power. He will, therefore, have to work 6 other hours, which I shall call hours of surplus labor, which surplus labor will realize itself in a surplus value and a surplus produce. If our spinner, for example, by his daily labor of 6 hours, added 3 shillings' value to the cotton, a value forming an extent equivalent to his wages, he will, in 12 hours, add 6 shillings' worth to the cotton, and produce a proportional surplus of yarn. As he has sold his laboring power to the capitalist, the whole value of produce created by him belongs to the capitalist, the owner pro tem of his laboring power. By advancing 3 shillings, the capitalist will therefore realize a value of 6 shillings, because, advancing a value in which 6 hours of labor are crystallized, he will receive in return a value in which 12 hours of labor are crystallized. By repeating this same process daily, the capitalist will daily advance 3 shillings and daily pocket 6 shillings, one half of which will go to pay wages anew, and the other half of which will form surplus value, for which the capitalist pays no equivalent. It is this sort of exchange between capital and labor upon which capitalistic production, or the wages system, is founded, and which must constantly result in reproducing the working man as a working man, and the capitalist as a capitalist. The rate of surplus value, all other circumstances remaining the same, will depend on the proportion between that part of the working day necessary to reproduce the value of the laboring power and the surplus time or surplus labor performed for the capitalist. It will, therefore, depend on the ratio in which the working day is prolonged over and above that extent, by working which the working man would only reproduce the value of his laboring power, or replace his wages. 10. Value of labor. We must now return to the expression value or price of labor. We have seen that, in fact, it is only the value of the laboring power measured by the values of commodities necessary for its maintenance. But, since the working man receives his wages after his labor is performed, and knows, moreover, that what he actually gives to the capitalist is his labor, the value or price of his laboring power necessarily appears to him as the price or value of his labor itself. If the price of his laboring power is 3 shillings in which 6 hours of labor are realized, and if he works 12 hours, he necessarily considers these 3 shillings as the value or price of 12 hours of labor, although these 12 hours of labor realize themselves in the value of 6 shillings. A double consequence flows from this. Firstly, the value or price of the laboring power takes the semblance of the price or value of labor itself, although, strictly speaking, value and price of labor are senseless terms. Secondly, although one part only of the working man's daily labor is paid, while the other part is unpaid, and while that unpaid or surplus labor constitutes exactly the fund out of which surplus value or profit is formed, it seems as if the aggregate labor was paid labor. This false appearance distinguishes wages labor from other historical forms of labor. On the basis of the wages system, even the unpaid labor seems to be paid labor. With the slave, on the contrary, even that part of his labor which is paid appears to be unpaid. Of course, in order to work, the slave must live, and one part of his working day goes to replace the value of his own maintenance. But since no bargain is struck between him and his master, and no acts of selling and buying are going on between the two parties, all his labor seems to be given away for nothing. Take, on the other hand, the peasant serf, such as he, I might say, until yesterday existed in the whole of East Europe. This peasant worked, for example, 3 days for himself on his own field, or the field allotted to him, and 3 subsequent days he performed compulsory and gratuitous labor on the estate of his lord. Here, then, the paid and unpaid parts of labor were sensibly separated in time and space, and our liberals overflowed with moral indignation at the preposterous notion of making a man work for nothing. In point of fact, however, whether a man works 3 days of the week for himself on his own field, and 3 days for nothing on the estate of his lord, or whether he works in the factory or the workshop 6 hours daily for himself, and 6 for his employer, comes to the same, although in the latter case, the paid and unpaid portions of labor are inseparably mixed up with each other, and the nature of the whole transaction is completely masked by the intervention of a contract, and the pay received at the end of the week. The gratuitous labor appears to be voluntarily given in the one instance, and to be compulsory in the other. That makes all the difference. In using the value labor of power, I shall only use it as a popular slang term for the value of laboring power. 10. Profit is made by selling a commodity at its value. Suppose an average hour of labor to be realized in a value equal to 6 pence, or 12 average hours of labor to be realized in 6 shillings. Suppose, further, the value of labor to be 3 shillings, or the produce of 6 hours' labor. If, then, in the raw material, machinery, and so forth, and used up in a commodity, 24 hours of average labor were realized, its value would amount to 12 shillings. If, moreover, the workman employed by the capitalist added 12 hours of labor to those means of production, these 12 hours would be realized in an additional value of 6 shillings. The total value of the product would therefore amount to 36 hours of realized labor and be equal to 18 shillings. But as the value of labor, or the wages paid to a workman, would be 3 shillings only, no equivalent would have been paid by the capitalist for the 6 hours of surplus labor worked by the workman, and realized in the value of the commodity. By selling this commodity at its value for 18 shillings, the capitalist would, therefore, realize a value of 3 shillings for which had no paid equivalent. These 3 shillings would constitute the surplus value, or profit pocketed by him. The capitalist would consequently realize the profit of 3 shillings, not by selling his commodity at a price over and above its value, but by selling it at its real value. The value of a commodity is determined by the total quantity of labor contained in it, but part of that quantity of labor is realized in a value for which an equivalent has been paid in the form of wages. Part of it is realized in a value for which no equivalent has been paid. Part of the labor contained in the commodity is paid labor, part is unpaid labor. By selling, therefore, the commodity at its value, that is, as the crystallization of the total quantity of labor bestowed upon it, the capitalist must necessarily sell it at a profit. He sells not only what has cost him an equivalent, but he sells also what has cost him nothing, although it has cost his workman labor. The cost of the commodity to the capitalist and its real cost are different things. I repeat, therefore, that normal and average profits are made by selling commodities not above, but at their real values. 11. The different parts into which surplus value is decomposed. The surplus value, or that part of the total value of the commodity in which the surplus labor or unpaid labor of the working man is realized, I call profit. The whole of that profit is not pocketed by the employing capitalist. The monopoly of land enables the landlord to take one part of that surplus value under the name of rent, whether the land is used for agricultural buildings or railways, or for any other productive purpose. On the other hand, the very fact that the possession of the instruments of labor enables the employing capitalist to produce a surplus value, or what comes to the same, to appropriate to himself a certain amount of unpaid labor, enables the owner of the means of labor which he lends wholly or partly to the employing capitalist, enables, in one word, the money-lending capitalist to claim for himself, under the name of interest, another part of the surplus value, so that there remains to the employing capitalist as such only what is called industrial or commercial profit. By what laws this division of the total amount of surplus value amongst these 3 categories of people is regulated is a question quite foreign to our subject. This much, however, results from what has been stated. Rent, interest, and industrial profit are only different names for different parts of the surplus value of the commodity, or the unpaid labor enclosed in it, and they are equally derived from this source and from this source alone. They are not derived from land as such or from capitals as such, but land and capital enable their owners to get their respective shares out of the surplus value extracted by the employing capitalist from the laborer. For the laborer himself, it is a matter of subordinate importance whether that surplus value, the result of his surplus labor, or unpaid labor, is altogether pocketed by the employing capitalist, or whether the latter is obliged to pay portions of it, under the name of rent and interest, away to third parties. Suppose the employing capitalist to use only his own capital and to be his own landlord, then the whole surplus value would go into his pocket. It is the employing capitalist who immediately extracts from the laborer this surplus value, whatever part of it he may ultimately be able to keep for himself. Upon this relation, therefore, between the employing capitalist and the wages laborer, the whole wages system and the whole present system of production hinge. Some of the citizens who took part in our debate were, there, wrong in trying to mince matters, and to treat this fundamental relation between the employing capitalist and the working man as a secondary question, although they were right in stating that under given circumstances, a rise of prices might affect in very unequal degrees the employing capitalist, the landlord, the moneyed capitalist, and, if you please, the tax-gatherer. Another consequence follows from what has been stated. That part of the value of the commodity which represents only the value of the raw materials, the machinery, in one word, the value of the means of production used up, forms no revenue at all, but replaces only capital. But apart from this, it is false that the other part of the value of the commodity which forms revenue, or may be spent in the form of wages, profits, rent, interest, is constituted by the value of wages, the value of rent, the value of profits, and so forth. We shall, in the first instance, discard wages and only treat industrial profits, interest, and rent. We have just seen that this surplus value contained in the commodity, or that part of its value in which unpaid labor is realized, resolves itself into different fractions, bearing 3 different names. But it would be quite the reverse of the truth to say that its value is composed of or formed by the addition of the independent values of these 3 constituents. If 1 hour of labor realizes itself in the value of 6 pence, if the working day of the laborer comprises 12 hours, if half this time is unpaid labor, that surplus labor will add to the commodity a surplus value of 3 shillings, that is, a value for which no equivalent has been paid. This surplus value of 3 shillings constitute the whole fund, which the employing capitalist may divide, in whatever proportions, with the landlord and the money-lender. The value of these 3 shillings constitutes the limit of the value they have to divide amongst them. But it is not the employing capitalist who adds to the value of the commodity an arbitrary value for his profit, to which another value is added for the landlord, and so forth, so that the addition of these arbitrarily fixed values would constitute the total value. You see, therefore, the fallacy of the popular notion which confounds the decomposition of a given value into 3 parts with the formation of that value by the addition of 3 independent values, thus converting the aggregate value from which rent, profit, and interest are derived into an arbitrary magnitude. If the total profit realized by a capitalist is equal to £100, we call this sum considered as absolute magnitude the amount of profit, but we calculate the ratio at which those £100 bear to the capital advanced. We call this relative magnitude, the rate of profit. It is evident that this rate of profit may be expressed in a double way. Suppose £100 to be the capital advanced in wages, if the surplus value created is also £100, and this would show us that half the working day of the laborer consists of unpaid labor, and if we measure this profit by the value of the capital advanced in wages, we should say that the rate of profit amounted to 100%, because the value advanced would be 100 and the value realized would be 200. If, on the other hand, we should not only consider the capital advanced in wages, but the total capital advanced, say, for example, £500, of which £400 represented the value of raw materials, machinery, and so forth, we should say that the rate of profit amounted only to 20%, because the profit of 100 would be but the 5th part of the total capital advance. The first mode of expressing the rate of profit is the only one which shows you the real ratio between paid and unpaid labor, the real degree of the exploitation, you must allow me this French word, of labor. The other mode of expression that is in common use, and is indeed appropriate for certain purposes. At all events, it is very useful for concealing the degree in which the capitalist extracts gratuitous labor from the workman. In the remarks I have still to make, I shall use the word profit for the whole amount of the surplus value extracted by the capitalist, without any regard to the division of that surplus value between different parties, and in using the words rate of profit, I shall always measure profits by the value of the capital advanced in wages. 12. General relation of profits, wages, and prices. Deduct from the value of a commodity the value replacing the value of the raw materials and the other means of production used upon it, that is to say, deduct the value representing the past labor contained in it, and the remainder of its value will resolve into the quantity of labor added by the working man last employed. If that working man works 12 hours daily, if 12 hours of average labor crystallize themselves in an amount of gold equal to 6 shillings, this additional value of 6 shillings is the only value his labor will have created. This given value, determined by the time of his labor, is the only fund from which both he and the capitalist have to draw from their respective shares, or dividends, the only value to be divided into wages and profits. It is evident that this value itself will not be altered by the variable proportions in which it may be divided amongst the two parties. There will also be nothing changed if in the place of one working man you put the whole working population, 12 million working days, for example, instead of one. Since the capitalist and workman have only to divide this limited value, that is, the value measured by the total labor of the working man, the more the one gets, the less will the other get, and vice versa. Whenever a quantity is given, one part of it will increase inversely as the other it decreases. If the wages change, profits will change in an opposite direction. If wages fall, profits will rise. If wages rise, profits will fall. If the working man, on our former supposition, gets 3 shillings, equal to 1/2 of the value he has created, or if his whole working day consists half of paid, half of unpaid labor, the rate of profit will be 100%, because the capitalist would also get 3 shillings. If the working man receives only 2 shillings, or works only 1/3 of the whole day for himself, the capitalist will get 4 shillings, and the rate of profit will be 200%. If the working man receives 4 shillings, the capitalist will only receive 2, and the rate of profit would sink to 50%. But all these variations will not affect the value of the commodity. A general rise of wages would therefore result in a fall of the general rate of profit, but not affect values. But although the values of commodities, which must ultimately regulate their market prices, are exclusively determined by the total quantities of labor fixed in them, and not by the division of that quantity into paid and unpaid labor, it by no means follows that the values of the single commodities, or lots of commodities, produced during 12 hours, for example, will remain constant. The number or mass of commodities produced in a given time of labor, or by a given quantity of labor, depends upon the productive power of the labor employed, and not upon its extent or length. With 1 degree of the productive power of spinning labor, for example, a working day of 12 hours may produce 12 pounds of yarn, with a lesser degree of productive power only 2 pounds. If, then, 12 hours as average labor were realized in the value of 6 shillings in the one case, the 12 pounds of yarn would cost 6 shillings. In the other case, the 2 pounds of yarn would also cost 6 shillings. 1 pound of yarn would, therefore, cost 6 pence in the one case, and 3 shillings in the other. The difference of price would result from the difference in the productive powers of labor employed. 1 hour of labor would be realized in 1 pound of yarn, with the greater productive power, while, with the smaller productive power, 6 hours of labor would be realized in 1 pound of yarn. The price of a pound of yarn would, in the one instance, be only 6 pence, although wages were relatively high and the rate of profit low. It would be 3 shillings in the other instance, although wages were low and the rate of profit high. This would be so because the price of the pound of yarn is regulated by the total amount of labor worked up in it, and not by the proportional division of that total amount into paid and unpaid labor. The fact I have mentioned before that high-priced labor may produce cheap and low-priced labor may produce dear commodities loses, therefore, its paradoxical appearance. It is only the expression of the general law that the value of a commodity is regulated by the quantity of labor worked up in it, and the quantity of labor worked up in it depends altogether upon the productive powers of labor employed, and will therefore vary with every variation in the productivity of labor. 13. Main cases of attempts at raising wages or resisting their fall. Let us now seriously consider the main cases in which a rise of wages is attempted or a reduction of wages is resisted. Number 1. We have seen that the value of the laboring power, or in more popular parlance, the value of labor, is determined by the value of necessaries, or the quantity of labor required to produce them. If, then, in a given country the value of the daily average necessaries of the laborer represented 6 hours of labor expressed in 3 shillings, the laborer would have to work 6 hours daily to produce an equivalent for this daily maintenance. If the whole working day was 12 hours, the capitalist would pay him the value of his labor by paying him 3 shillings. Half the working day would be unpaid labor, and the rate of profit would amount to 100%. But now, suppose that consequent upon a decrease of productivity, more labor should be wanted to produce, say, the same amount of agricultural produce, so that the price of the average daily necessaries should rise from 3 to 4 shillings. In that case, the value of labor would rise by 1/3, or 33⅓%. 8 hours of the working day would be required to produce an equivalent for the daily maintenance of the laborer, according to his old standard of living. The surplus labor would therefore sink from 6 hours to 4, and the rate of profit from 100 to 50%. But, in insisting upon a rise of wages, the laborer would only insist upon getting the increased value of his labor, like every other seller of a commodity, who, the cost of his commodities having increased, tries to get its increased value paid. If wages did not rise or not sufficiently rise to compensate for the increased values of necessaries, the price of labor would sink below the value of labor, and the laborer's standard of life would deteriorate. But a change might also take place in an opposite direction. By virtue of the increased productivity of labor, the same amount of the average daily necessaries might sink from 3 to 2 shillings, or only 4 hours out of the working day instead of 6 be wanted to reproduce an equivalent for the value of the daily necessaries. The working man would now be able to buy with 2 shillings as many necessaries as he did before with 3 shillings. Indeed, the value of labor would have sunk, but diminished value would command the same amount of commodities as before. Then, profits would rise from 3 to 4 shillings, and the rate of profit from 100 to 200%. Although the laborer's absolute standard of life would have remained the same, his relative wages, and therewith his relative social position, as compared with that of the capitalist, would have been lowered. If the working man should resist that reduction of relative wages, he would only try to get some share in the increased productive powers of his own labor, and to maintain his former relative position in the social scale. Thus, after the abolition of the Corn Laws, and in flagrant violation of the most solemn pledges given during the anti-Corn Law agitation, the English factory lords generally reduced wages 10%. The resistance of the workmen was at first baffled, but consequent upon circumstances I cannot now enter upon, the 10% lost were afterwards regained. Number 2. The values of necessaries and consequently the value of labor might remain the same, but a change might occur in their money prices, consequent upon a previous change in the value of money. By the discovery of more fertile mines and so forth, 2 ounces of gold might, for example, cost no more labor to produce than 1 ounce did before. The value of gold would then be depreciated by 1/2, or 50%. As the values of all other commodities would then be expressed in twice their former money prices, so also the same with the value of labor. 12 hours of labor formerly expressed in 6 shillings would now be expressed in 12 shillings. If the working man's wages should remain 3 shillings instead of rising to 6 shillings, the money price of his labor would only be equal to half the value of his labor, and his standard of life would fearfully deteriorate. This would also happen in a greater or lesser degree if his wages should rise, but not proportionately to the fall in the value of gold. In such a case, nothing would have been changed, either in the productive powers of labor, or in supply and demand, or in values. Nothing would have changed except the money names of those values. To say that in such a case the workman ought to not insist upon a proportionate rise of wages is to say that he must be content to be paid with names instead of with things. All past history proves that whenever such a depreciation of money occurs, the capitalists are on the alert to seize this opportunity for defrauding the workman. A very large school of political economists assert that consequent upon the new discoveries of gold lands, the better working of silver mines, and the cheaper supply of quicksilver, the value of precious metals has again depreciated. This would explain the general and simultaneous attempts on the continent at a rise of wages. Number 3. We have till now supposed that the working day has given limits. The working day, however, has by itself no constant limits. It is the constant tendency of capital to stretch it to its utmost physically possible length, because, in the same degree, surplus labor and consequent the profit resulting therefrom will be increased. The more capital succeeds in prolonging the workday, the greater amount of the other people's labor it will appropriate. During the 17th and even the first 2/3 of the 18th century, a 10 hours as working day was the normal working day all over England. During the anti-Jacobin War, which was in fact a war waged by the British barons against the British working masses, capital celebrated its bacchanalia and prolonged the working day from 10 to 12, 14, 18 hours. Malthus, by no means a man whom you would suspect of a maudlin sentimentalism, declared in a pamphlet published about 1815 that if this sort of thing was to go on, the life of the nation would be attacked at its very source. A few years later, before the general introduction of newly invented machinery, about 1765, a pamphlet appeared in England under the title An Essay on Trade. The anonymous author, an avowed enemy of the working classes, declaims on the necessity of expanding the limits of the working day. Amongst other means to this end, he proposes working houses, which he says ought to be houses of terror. And what is the length of the working he prescribes for these houses of terror? 12 hours. The very same time which in 1832 was declared by capitalists, political economists, and ministers to be not only the existing, but the necessary time of labor for a child under 12 years. By selling his laboring power, he must do so under the present system. The working man makes over to the capitalist the consumption of that power, but within certain rational limits. He sells his laboring power in order to maintain it, apart from its natural wear and tear, but not to destroy it. In selling his labor power at its daily or weekly value, it is understood that in 1 day or 1 week, that laboring power shall not be submitted to 2 days' or 2 weeks' waste or wear and tear. Take a machine worth £1,000. If it is used up in 10 years, it will add to the value of the commodities in whose production it assists £100 yearly. If it is used up in 5 years, it will add £200 yearly, or the value of its annual wear and tear is in reverse ratio to the quickness with which it is consumed. But this distinguishes the working man from the machine. Machinery does not wear out exactly in the same ratio in which it is used. Man, on the contrary, decays in a greater ratio than would be visible from the mere numerical addition of work. In their attempts at reducing the working day to its former rational dimensions, or where they cannot enforce a legal fixation of a normal working day, at checking overwork by a rise of wages, a rise not only in proportion to the surplus time exacted, but in a greater proportion, working men fulfill only a duty to themselves and their race. They only set limits to the tyrannical usurpations of capital. Time is the room of human development. A man who has no free time to dispose of, whose whole lifetime, apart from the mere physical interruptions by sleep, meals, and so forth, is absorbed by his labor for the capitalist, is less than a beast of burden. He is a mere machine for producing foreign wealth, broken in body and brutalized in mind. Yet, the whole history of modern industry shows that capital, if not checked, will recklessly and ruthlessly work to cast down the whole working class to this utmost state of degradation. In prolonging the working day, the capitalist may pay higher wages and still lower the value of labor, if the rise of wages does not correspond to a greater amount of labor extracted, and the quicker decay of the laboring power thus caused. This may be done in another way. Your middle-class statisticians will tell you, for instance, that the average wages of factory families in Lancashire has risen. They forget that instead of the labor of the man, the head of the family, his wife, and perhaps 3 or 4 children are now thrown under the juggernaut wheels of capital, and that the rise of the aggregate wages does not correspond to the aggregate surplus labor extracted from the family. Even with given limits of the working day, such as they now exist in all branches of industry subjected to the factory laws, a rise of wages may become necessary, if only to keep up the old standard value of labor. By increasing the intensity of labor, a man may be made to expend as much vital force in 1 hour as he formerly did in 2. This has, to a certain degree, been effected in the trades, placed under the Factory Acts by the acceleration of machinery, and the greater number of working machines which a single individual has to now superintend. If the increase in the intensity of labor or the mass of labor spent in an hour keeps some fair proportion to the decrease in the extent of the working day, the working man will still be the winner. If this limit is overshot, he loses in one form what he has gained in another, and 10 hours of labor may then become as ruinous as 12 hours were before. In checking this tendency of capital, by struggling for a rise of wages corresponding to the rising intensity of labor, the working man only resists the depreciation of his labor and the deterioration of his race. Number 4. All of you know that from reasons I have not now to explain, capitalistic production moves through certain periodical cycles. It moves through a state of quiescence, growing animation, prosperity, overtrade, crisis, and stagnation. The market prices of commodities and the market rates of profit follow these phases, now sinking below their averages, now rising above them. Considering the whole cycle, you will find that one deviation of the market price is being compensated by the other, and that, taking advantage of the cycle, the market prices of commodities are regulated by their values. Well, during the phases of sinking market prices and the phases of crisis and stagnation, the working man, if not thrown out of employment altogether, is sure to have his wages lowered. Not to be defrauded, he must, even with such a fall of market prices, debate with the capitalist in what proportional degree a fall of wages has become necessary. If, during the phases of prosperity, when extra profits are made, he did not battle for a rise of wages, he would, taking the average of one industrial cycle, not even receive his average wages or the value of his labor. It is the utmost height of folly to demand that while his wages are necessarily affected by the adverse phases of the cycle, he should exclude himself from compensation during the prosperous phases of the cycle. Generally, the values of all commodities are only realized by the compensation of the continuously changing market prices, springing from the continuous fluctuations of demand and supply. On the basis of the present system, labor is only a commodity like others. It must, therefore, pass through the same fluctuations to fetch an average price corresponding to its value. It would be absurd to treat it on the one hand as a commodity, and to want on the other hand to exempt it from the laws which regulate the prices of commodities. The slave receives a permanent and fixed amount of maintenance. The wage laborer does not. He must try to get a rise of wages in the one instance, if only to compensate for a fall of wages in the other. If he resigned himself to accept the dictates of the capitalist as a permanent economic law, he would share in all the miseries of the slave without the security of the slave. Number 5. In all the cases I have considered, and they form 99 out of 100, you have seen that a struggle for the rise of wages follows only in the track of previous changes, and is the necessary offspring of previous changes in the amount of production, the productive powers of labor, the value of money, the extent or the intensity of labor extracted, the fluctuations of market prices, dependent on the fluctuations of demand and supply, and consistent with the different phases of the industrial cycle. In one word, as reactions of labor against the previous action of capital. By treating the struggle for a rise of wages independently of all these circumstances, by looking only upon the change of wages and overlooking all other changes from which they emanate, you proceed from a false premise in order to arrive at false conclusions. 14. The struggle between capital and labor and its results. Number 1. Having shown that the periodical resistance on the part of the working men against a reduction of wages, and their periodical attempts at getting a rise of wages, are inseparable from the wages system, and dictated by the very fact of labor being assimilated to commodities, and therefore subject to the laws regulating the general movement of prices. Having furthermore shown that a general rise of wages would result in a fall in the general rate of profit, but not affect the average prices of commodities or their values, the question now ultimately arises, how far in this instant struggle between capital and labor the latter is likely to prove successful. I might answer by a generalization and say that as with all other commodities, so with labor, its market price will fall, in the long run, adapt itself to its value, that, therefore, despite all the ups and downs and do what he may, the working man will, on an average, only receive the value of his labor which resolves into the value of his laboring power, which is determined by the value of the necessaries required for its maintenance and reproduction, which value of necessaries finally is regulated by the quantity of labor wanted to produce them. But there are some peculiar features which distinguish the value of the laboring power, or the value of labor, from the values of all other commodities. The value of the laboring power is formed by two elements, the one merely physical, the other historical or social. Its ultimate limit is determined by the physical element, that is to say, to maintain and reproduce itself. To perpetuate its physical existence, the working class must receive the necessaries absolutely indispensable for living and multiplying. The value of those indispensable necessaries forms, therefore, the ultimate limit of the value of labor. On the other hand, the length of the working day is also limited by ultimate, although very elastic, boundaries. Its ultimate limit is given by the physical force of the laboring man. If the daily exhaustion of his vital forces exceeds a certain degree, it cannot be exerted anew day by day. However, as I said, this limit is very elastic. A quick succession of unhealthy and short-lived generations will keep the labor market as well supplied as a series of vigorous and long-lived generations. Besides this merely physical element, the value of labor is in every country determined by a traditional standard of life. It is not mere physical labor, but it is the satisfaction of certain wants springing from the social conditions in which people are placed and reared up. The English standard of life may be reduced to the Irish standard, the standard of life of a German peasant to that of a Livonian peasant. The important part which historical tradition and social habitude play in this respect, you may learn from Mr. Thornton's work on overpopulation, where he shows that the average wages in different agricultural districts of England still nowadays differ more or less according to the more favorable or less favorable circumstances under which the districts have emerged from the state of serfdom. This historical or social element entering into the value of labor may be expanded or contracted or altogether extinguished, so that nothing remains but the physical limit. During the time of the anti-Jacobin War, undertaken as the incorrigible tax-eater and sinecurist, old George Rose used to say, to save the comforts of our holy religion from the inroads of the French infidels, the honest English farmers, so tenderly handled in the former chapter of ours, depressed the wages of the agricultural laborers even beneath that mere physical minimum, but made up by poor laws the remainder necessary for the physical perpetuation of the race. This was a glorious way to convert the wages laborer into a slave, and Shakespeare's proud yeoman into a pauper. By comparing the standard wages or values of labor in different countries, and by comparing them in different historical epochs of the same country, you will find that the value of labor itself is not a fixed but a variable magnitude, even supposing the values of all other commodities to remain constant. A similar comparison would prove that not only the market rates of profit change, but its average rates. But, as to profits, there exists no law which determines their minimum. We cannot say what is the ultimate limit of their decrease. Why cannot we fix that limit? Because, although we can fix the minimum of wages, we cannot fix their maximum. We can only say that the limits of the working day being given, the maximum profit corresponds to the physical minimum of wages, and that, wages being given, the maximum of profit corresponds to such a prolongation of the working day as is compatible with the physical forces of the laborer. The maximum of profit is therefore limited by the physical minimum of wages and the physical maximum of the working day. It is evident that between the two, limits of the maximum rate of profit and immense scale of variations is possible. The fixation of its actual degree is only settled by the continuous struggle between capital and labor, the capitalist constantly tending to reduce wages to their physical minimum, and to extend the working day to its physical maximum, while the working man constantly presses in the opposite direction. The matter resolves itself into a question of the respective powers of the combatants. 2. As to the limitation of the working day in England, as in all other countries, it has never been settled except by legislative interference. Without the working men's continuous pressure from without, that interference would have never taken place. But, at all events, the result was not to be attained by private settlement between the working men and capitalists. This very necessity of general political action affords the proof that in its merely economical action, capital is the stronger side. As to the limits of the value of labor, its actual settlement always depends upon supply and demand. I mean the demand for labor on the part of capital, and the supply of labor by the working men. In colonial countries, the law of supply and demand favors the working man, hence the relatively high standards of wages in the United States. Capital may there try its utmost. It cannot prevent the labor market from being continuously emptied by the continuous conversion of wages laborers into independent, self-sustaining peasants. The position of a wages laborer is for a very large part of the American people but a probational state, which they are sure to leave within a longer or shorter term. To mend this colonial state of things, the paternal British government accepted for some time what is called the modern colonization theory, which consists in putting an artificial high price upon colonial land, in order to prevent the too quick conversion of the wages laborer into the independent peasant. But now let us come to the old civilized countries, in which capital domineers over the whole process of production. Take, for example, the rise in England of agricultural wages from 1849 to 1859. What was its consequence? The farmers could not, as our friend Weston would have advised them, raise the value of wheat, nor even its market prices. They had, on the contrary, to submit to their fall. but during these 11 years they introduced machinery of all sorts, adopted more scientific methods, converted part of arable land into pasture, increased the size of farms, and, with the scale of production, and by these and other processes, diminishing the demand for labor by increasing its productive power, made the agricultural population again relatively redundant. This is the general method in which a reaction, quicker or slower, of capital against a rise of wages takes place in old, settled countries. Ricardo has justly remarked that machinery is in constant competition with labor, and can often be only introduced when the price of labor has reached a certain height, but the appliance of machinery is but one of the many methods for increasing the productive powers of labor. The very same development which makes common labor relatively redundant simplifies, on the other hand, skilled labor, and thus depreciates it. The same law obtains in another form. With the development of the productive powers of labor, the accumulation of capital will be accelerated, even despite a relatively high rate of wages. Hence, one might infer, as Adam Smith, in whose days modern industry was still in its infancy, did infer, that the accelerated accumulation of capital must turn the balance in favor of the working man by securing a growing demand for his labor. From this same standpoint, many contemporary writers have wondered that English capital, having grown in the last 20 years so much quicker than English population, wages should not have been more enhanced. But, simultaneously with the progress of accumulation, there takes place a progressive change in the composition of capital. That part of the aggregate capital which consists of fixed capital, machinery, raw materials, means of production, in all possible forms, progressively increases as compared with the other part of capital, which is laid out in wages, or in the purchase of labor. This law has been stated in a more or less accurate manner by Mr. Barton, Ricardo, Sismondi, Professor Richard Jones, Professor Ramsay, Cher-Boulier, and others. If the proportion of these two elements of capital was originally 1:1, it will, in the progress of industry, become 5:1, and so forth. If of a total capital of 600, 300 is laid out in instruments, raw materials, and so forth, and 300 in wages, the total capital wants only to be doubled to create a demand for 600 working men instead of for 300. But, if of a capital of 600, 500 is laid out in machinery, materials, and so forth, and 100 only in wages, the same capital must increase from 600 to 3,600 in order to create a demand for 600 workmen instead of 300. In the progress of industry, the demand for labor keeps, therefore, no pace with the accumulation of capital. It will still increase, but increase in a constantly diminishing ratio as compared with the increase of capital. These few hints will suffice to show that the very development of modern industry must progressively turn the scale in favor of the capitalist against the working man, and that, consequently, the general tendency of capitalistic production is not to rise, but to sink the average standard of wages, or to push the value of labor more or less to its minimum limit. Such being the tendency of things in this system, is this saying that the working class ought to renounce their resistance against the encroachments of capital and abandon their attempts at making the best of the occasional chances for their temporary improvement? If they did, they would be degraded to one level mass of broken wretches past salvation. I think I have shown that their struggles for a standard of wages are incidents inseparable from the whole wages system, that in 99 cases out of 100, their efforts at raising wages are only efforts at maintaining the given value of labor, and that the necessity of debating their price with the capitalist is inherent to their condition of having to sell themselves as commodities. By cowardly giving away in their everyday conflict with capital, they would certainly disqualify themselves for the initiation of any larger movement. At the same time, and quite apart from the general servitude involved in the wages system, the working class ought not to exaggerate to themselves the ultimate working of these everyday struggles. They ought not to forget that they are fighting with effects, not with the causes of those effects, that they are retarding the downward movement but not changing its direction, that they are applying palliatives, not curing the malady. They ought, therefore, not to be exclusively absorbed in these unavoidable guerrilla fights, instantly springing up from the never-ceasing encroachments of capital or changing of the market. They ought to understand that, with all the miseries it imposes upon them, the present system simultaneously engenders the material conditions and the social forms necessary for an economical reconstruction of society. Instead of the conservative motto, "A fair day's wage for a fair day's work," they ought to inscribe on their banner the revolutionary watchword, "Abolition of the wages system." After this very long and I fear tedious exposition which I was obliged to enter into to do some justice to the subject matter, I shall conclude by proposing the following resolutions. Firstly, a general rise in the rate of wages would result in a fall of the general rate of profit, but, broadly speaking, not affect the prices of commodities. Secondly, the general tendency of capitalist production is not to rise but to sink the average standard of wages. Thirdly, trade unions work well as centers of resistance against the encroachments of capital. They fail partially from an injudicious use of their power. They fail generally from limiting themselves to a guerrilla war against the effects of the existing system, instead of simultaneously trying to change it, instead of using their organized forces as a lever for the final emancipation of the working class, that is to say, the ultimate abolition of the wages system. And that's the end of the text. Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed and learned something interesting and radicalizing. It's always super cool to hear y'all's perspectives, so feel free to leave a comment letting me know what you thought. Be sure to check out my other videos and like, subscribe, and share. Again, thank you for being here, and until next time, I'm leaving y'all with love and solidarity from the South.